Hello and welcome to my NAP. NAP stands for Nonprofit Auditor Points, and I'm Irina Ryshkova, your nonprofit auditor. I created these NAPs to help nonprofit community, to share my experience over the years that I accumulated working with nonprofits as an auditor. Okay, let's talk about termination clause in the grant agreements. It's a very interesting topic from my standpoint because there's two different opinions that exist right now among auditors. Some CPAs argue that termination clause that can be present in the grant agreements are boilerplate and merely legal noise and should be ignored. Others saying it carries real legal weight. My position, and the position supported by legal interpretation, and I do believe it's supported by principle behind the general accepted accounting principles, that if a donor explicitly retains legal rights to terminate the grant at any time at their sole discretion, it cannot be enforceable promise. Therefore, there is no revenue can be recorded until cash is actually received. Your nonprofit needs to consult with your auditor just to make sure that you are on the same page with your auditor. However, it's my true belief in interpretation of the GAAP rules that if the termination clause exists, it needs to be treated seriously and it's not a simple boilerplate. Let's explain this. Understanding what is the grant agreement really is. Nonprofits need to look in the grant letter and see if the grant letter creates legally enforceable promise between a donor and nonprofit. If a donor promises something, for example, donation of $100,000, the nonprofit must be able to rely on that promise. The donor must not retain a full discretion to withdraw from promise. If any of these elements fail, the agreement does not present promise. And we know that according to the standards, that only unconditional promise represents real revenue. Therefore, if no such promise exists, should not be recorded as a revenue. Termination clause can be presented on the agreement, and why it's critical. A termination clause gives a legal right to a donor to stop or cancel grant agreement at any time. So sometimes termination clause can be put differently. Both parties can terminate. For example, nonprofit can say we don't need your money anymore, and donor can say we will stop a donation, but before we do, we both need to agree. Sometimes termination clause can have if the nonprofit violates something, or nonprofits fail to meet some condition, or the most problematic, in my opinion, if the donor retains unilateral, solely discretion, can terminate the grant. In my opinion, if the donor has a sole discretion to terminate the grant at any time, it's a red flag and it's not a promise. Sometimes termination clause can have some description where really just general that in order to receive funds, nonprofits still need to be in good standing as a public charity. That can be viewed as the administrative boilerplate because in order to receive any funds, nonprofit needs to be in good standing in public charity. Because if nonprofit fails its nonprofit status, it cannot obtain any funds. But if it's actually donor who can terminate the gift at any point, that's not a promise. Unilateral termination means the donor can revoke promise for any reason or for no reason whatsoever. Then nonprofit cannot really enforce that promise. And therefore, this promise carries no legal meaning. No court will enforce it unless really nonprofit really relied on that promise and already had some contracts or work in place because of the reliance on that promise. Perspective one. First perspective, I do know several CPAs who do treat as a boilerplate and they ignoring this termination clause at sole discretion, and they do believe it needs to be recorded as a revenue. This is, in my opinion, it creates problem. Why? Because first of all, it's not legally enforceable. And if donor really terminates the promise and nonprofit did record revenue, then nonprofit will need to be recognizing loss, and for previous years, revenue will be overstated. It's not a conservative approach which GAAP relies on. The second group of CPAs, which I also part of it, believes that the promise is not enforceable and nonprofit has no rights to the assets. No revenue should be recorded and it's just illusory promise. And that's more conservative treatment. We believe that's in accordance with the GAAP because there is no promise made. It's illusory promise. It's not enforceable. Therefore, no revenue, no receivable, and only revenue will be recorded when the funds are actually received. Following the first approach, when you will termination clause, when the donor says we are in sole discretion, can just stop grant at any time, can cause overstatement of revenue, non-compliance with the overall rules, and misleading to the reader, risky, and could be problematic during the audits because the auditor might not agree with your position. They might actually demand decreasing revenue, changing your books, lead to material adjustments, significant deficiencies, material weaknesses, and worst case, that your financial statements previously issued can appear financially stronger than they actually should be, and in future years, your nonprofit might need to record losses. Why administrative boilerplate is not an excuse? Legal language exists because of legal meaning. So saying it's a simply legal boilerplate, that's very weak position because legally meaning not enforceable. But promise by definition, it needs to be legally enforceable promise. So boilerplate does not really count because it's not a commitment, it's not obligation, it's not enforceable. Revenue recognition for nonprofits do follow contract law. And contract law is very clear that if the promise is illusory, it's not a promise. And definition of the promise is legally enforceable promise. So if it's not legally enforceable, nonprofits cannot record as revenue. Therefore, my conclusion, if your nonprofit receive a grant letter or gift where in appendices, in somewhere in agreement, donor said, we at our sole discretion can terminate or cancel grant at any point without any reasons, it's not a promise. And it should not be recorded as revenue until funds are received. Thank you so much. Hopefully it was useful. Be safe and have a wonderful day.